Hi everybody, welcome to week 3 of our class discussion or of our section on Intro to Religious Studies. This section is going to be religion and social structure as the week 3 readings and the week 3 blog entry. So what I was going to do is there's also a lecture up by Dr. Clayton Bench. He's taught this class before, but I thought I would kind of give my own take on it, show you what I mean when I talk about social construction and go through the material. It's quite similar to what Dr. Bench is all about, but again, I thought it would serve us well if I did it also. So I will be posting or have posted a slideshow PowerPoint, so please follow along. I guess I'd like you at this point to jump to the second slide, and we'll sort of talk about social practice and what we actually mean by that. And this, I take a quote right from Martin's book on page 46, Social Practice. These sorts of practices are created by human beings, but then are repeated over and over so much that they appear to be necessary. Okay? Now, what this means is that in everyday society, a lot of scholars call social practice appear on the surface to be sort of natural or necessary parts of social construction. But when we dig a little deeper and we go a little more critically into the material, pick them apart, we see that there is nothing really about them except there's some sort of inherent tradition that for one reason or another have persisted over time. So, for example, there's a bunch of them, like when somebody sneezes, you say, bless you, right? Getting in trouble or causing a brouhaha if you open an umbrella inside. There's no reason why we can't do that. There's nothing saying that that's a bad thing. But the idea that there's some sort of social practice based around that is certainly part of it. Removing your hat during certain points. During social events, during singing of national anthems, for instance. Again, it's seen as a sign of respect, but there's no inherent naturalness to these things. These are sort of ritual things that we do over and over again. One of my favorites is actually taking your shoes off when you go into somebody's home. I have a friend from Alabama who, when he came to Canada, realized that in Canada, that's what you do. You take your shoes off when you go into somebody's house. And for him, that seemed really weird. It was almost it's a very personal thing. He said it was like going into somebody's house and taking off your pants and sitting around in your underwear. So again, social practice differs from group to group. And to me, it seemed perfectly reasonable to take off your shoes. To leave them on seemed weird. But for him, again, of course, that would be something else. Now we have other examples that are perhaps a bit more ritualistic or seem so, such like the social practice of marriage. Wedding rings, for instance, white dresses, that whole idea of throwing rice or cars dragging cans, that kind of stuff, that seems a little more ritualized, of course. What we would see that as sort of tradition, perhaps. And some of these practices hold less authority than others. For instance, no one threw rice at my wedding. No one tied cans to the bumper of my car. It was a Canadian wedding. We threw hockey sticks and we tied maple syrup cans to the back of the car. I'm kidding. Anyway. However, for some, wearing something like not wearing white at a wedding, that would be considered a serious taboo. Or not buying an engagement ring or wearing a wedding band would be seen as somehow a breach of these sort of social practices that we all sort of adhere to. And again, I'll go back to my own example. When I was married, a lot of traditions were sort of ignored. We didn't bother with a lot of them. But my ex-wife's mother really wanted us to wear the men to wear tuxedos. She wanted bridesmaids' dresses, the white dress, and have it done in a church. And this made it legit. There was something authoritative about doing that kind of thing, as opposed to just going to a justice of the peace or something to that effect. Okay, and this is articulated in the quote by Martin. He says, and I quote, "We can face significant social consequences were we to violate social practice." Okay, so there is a certain element. If I refuse to take my hat off during the singing of a national anthem, there could be social consequences, right? I mean, again, it depends on how severe and depends on where you are, but I think you get what I mean, okay? So if you jump down to the next slide, slide 3. Now a question to consider is, how do these traditions actually arise? How is it they become second nature to us? Or what gives them that feeling of being natural? Okay, and that's an important thing. There's something about a lot of this stuff that we'll talk about throughout the rest of the term, that these things that we do have a sense of naturalness to them, that somehow we don't do them because they are, they're ritual or what have you, but they're second nature. They're something that we just have to do. So the first is, I want to give you a quote from one of the famous dead white guys, Emile Durkheim. He was a famous anthropologist. He wrote lots of stuff, but he's done some seriously interesting work when it comes to social construction. And he's one of our functionalists that we've talked about in the past. And I'll read from his quote, which comes straight out of Martin, page 74. It goes, "It is patently obvious that all education consists of continual effort to impose upon the child ways of seeing, thinking, and acting which he himself would not have arrived at spontaneously. From his," and of course he's using gendered pronouns, "earliest years, we oblige him to eat, drink, and sleep at regular hours, and to observe cleanliness, calm, and obedience. Later we force him to learn how to be mindful of others, to respect customs and conventions, and to work, etc. If this constraint in time ceases to be felt, it is because it gradually gives rise to habits, to inner tendencies which render it superfluous. But they supplant the constraint only because they are derived from it." Okay, so what Durkheim is trying to tell us is that a lot of the things that we do that seem second nature are not second nature. They happen because we are taught that that is the proper way to do things. You don't do this, you do that, okay? And now, again, from our own context, it's really hard to see these things happening. So if you jump to the next slide, I'll give you a little quote from Bruce Lincoln. And again, this comes from Martin on page 51. And this also comes from Bruce Lincoln's thesis on method. "Understanding the system of ideology that operates in one's own society is made difficult by two factors. One, one's consciousness is itself a product of that system. And two, the system's very success renders its operations invisible, since one is so consistently immersed and bombarded by its products that one comes to mistake them and the apparatus through which they are produced and disseminated for nothing other than nature." Okay? So what Lincoln is saying is that we are a product of our social practice. I can't divorce myself from my own social practice. I grew up in a very lower middle class, predominantly white Canadian context. I am another product of that. I can be aware that I'm a product of that, but it's hard to get past that. Okay, so we are formed by these things that are going on. And the second point is that these systems don't look like systems because they are so successful. It is really hard to see how you have been constrained by the social systems that are going on within your own social context. Now, Lincoln points out that it's easier to find those kinds of problems, or not problems, those kind of constructions in other people's social systems. But that's because they're other people's. It's easier for us to see what is going on. And again, so what these two quotes are trying to tell us, well, it seems that the most basic interpretation is that that which seems natural within our social constructs or social conditions is really just what we have been indoctrinated into believing. It's what all the influences around us have given us this impression that this is the proper way of doing things. And this isn't a bad thing. I mean, using terms like indoctrinated and things like that sort of have negative connotations. But all cultures at all times do this. This is just the way humans tend to operate. But as Lincoln says, it's harder to see it when it's within our own context. We can't see why something is considered weird. Now, one of the ones I always liked, I don't know if you guys had this one or not, but my mom would insist that I never put my shoes on the table. Don't know why. And to this day, I have trouble putting shoes on the table. I mean, when the opportunity comes up, I insist on doing so. So just in context, here's my shoe. It's on the table. Whoa, social construct completely broken. Weird. Anyway, so you can kind of probably come up with these examples in of yourself. Okay? Take a jump to the next slide. This would be slide 5. This is where we talk a little bit about the insider and the outsider. And again, to quote Martin, all societies are made up of categories that distinguish between who is included and who is excluded. Okay? This is Martin on page 45. As regards to any society and the institutions within society, be it government, politics, religious institutions, sort of family units, these kinds of things, there are, of course, rules. We have categories, modes of dress, modes of speech, ways of living that distinguish us, those on the inside, from those out there somehow on the outside. Okay? So it's not just about what makes us, but what also makes us different from them, those people over there, those them that are not us. In other words, how do we not only construct ourselves, right? Or I should say how these social systems not only construct us as a bounded group, however you want to define us, I mean that's certainly up in the air, but also how it allows these partitionings to happen. So those on the outside can be seen as being outside. So you have this insider and this outsider. And this is accomplished in a couple of ways, but one of the ways that comes up a lot in religious studies is this term called othering. Okay, you other somebody else. Now the process of othering occurs when the insider, me, us, what have you, however you want to define it, refuses to allow a perceived otherness, be it a new way of being, a new mode of living, a different cultural group, a different religion, political system, what have you, to make inroads into their us, in modifying the current insider social practice. And this process is a lot of times very preemptive. There are institutions, there are mechanisms usually within a society that preemptively stop these kinds of things from happening, that fiercely defend this order, to keep the others out, and even to keep them away completely. And there's lots of current examples that we can think of. We had this happen in Europe, we've had this happen in North America. Brexit, the UK's leaving of the European Union, a lot of the rhetoric around that was based upon the dangerous other, the refugee coming from, say, Syria, coming into the UK and taking from us what is ours, right? That was a big deal when it came to Brexit. And a lot of discussions happened around that. You also have that, say, North America, Canada, United States, where there's been discussion about allowing refugees, especially from Syria, into both countries, and how that could impact our way of life, depending on how you want to think about that. And this otherness is usually considered something like Islam or Muslimness or something that it would be problematic to our Christian or our secular way of life. Somehow there's a juxtaposition that is going on. Okay? Another one, and I have a link from the Huffington Post, it's a little less politically charged, but it is equally as instructive, is something called purity balls. This idea that a young Christian girl, an adolescent, will go on essentially a date with their dad, sign an agreement or make a vow in which they will abstain from premarital sex until they, of course, are married, at which time their father then will essentially transfer their protective rights or duties to the new husband. It kind of reminds me, weirdly enough, of Game of Thrones. I don't know if anybody's watched Game of Thrones, but there's this moment where when Sansa, spoilers, keeping it, becomes essentially a Lannister. She wears her own Stark cloak, like with the white wolf and everything. It is taken off, and then her husband's cloak is placed on top of her. It's sort of a symbol that now she is part of the family, but she is under his protection. That kind of thing. Okay. Now again, this practice of purity balls certainly does very similar conceptual work that this whole brouhaha over the Islamic refugees does, but on a much smaller and perhaps a less obvious scale. But you can kind of see how the mechanisms perhaps work. So unlike the Muslim outsider, this aims to set up a clear boundary between those vowing abstinence and the others outside of that. In this case, those others are those who happen to have premarital sex. There seems to be this real interest in maintaining that distinction. However, there's a lot more than going on here than meets the eye. You have this overarching concern that is built into with like Christian fundamentalist theology that looms in the background. It sees itself as being very biblically authentic and authorized. So we have these systems that say, well, the Bible says this, so this is why I am doing these kinds of things. It's also very heteronormative. In no place is there a position for same-sex marriage. How that does not even figure within to this conceptual horizon. And finally, though I could say much more, this practice is really about male domination and patriarchal structures. Basically, it presents female sexuality as something that needs to be controlled and needs to be exchanged between men, be it the female's father or her husband. And again, without getting into the rightness or wrongness of these things, you could hopefully see that all of these elements combine, create this sort of boundary between the insider, the patriarchal, male, fundamentalist Christian, versus those who are outside. And it is sort of seen as this perceived, it is a reaction to this perceived onslaught of overt sexuality, that people are being too sexual, that, you know, our old traditions are falling away and people are getting pregnant and teen pregnancies up. And this is a way to subvert that and to establish a boundary around it. So you have the immoral outsider with, you know, weird, problematic sexual practices, premarital sex. Homosexuality would be seen as one from this context. Gender equality would also be seen as somewhat problematic, versus what the insider, the people who are performing these purity balls, would be all about. Okay? And finally, the last quote, social order exists only as a product of human activity. And this is again quoted from Martin. So social systems, which also include ideology, politics, religion, sports, that's a big one, what have you, all guide and constrain how people within these social systems see themselves within their social context. Social systems are there to guide people, the subjects, that's sort of how we talk about it, within the system by establishing and reinforcing what is essentially acceptable behavior from the context of the people making these boundaries. So it's sort of the unwritten codes that we live by. You know, one of the ones I always find funny is like when you're on a bus and people stand too close to you, or you see somebody picking their nose, or something weird, right? Like you see these sort of unwritten social codes, and you're like, it's something weird, and we need to avoid that. Okay. Now, of course, certain religious institutions, systems encourage, even demand that their members live by these kinds of codes of conduct, and this can be types of speech, type of behavior, types of dress is also a good indication. Something like Orthodox Judaism, a lot of Islamic groups, they have a very certain, and I guess from the point of view of, say, the average North American, distinct way of dressing. But if you happen to go to a place where this is dominant, this wouldn't be seen as weird. This would be seen as the way you normally do things. We only notice it because it's not part of our context. Even in North American Christianity, we have a certain elements of this as well. Most folks dress up when they go to church, for instance. That seems like a common thing. You don't go in your scruffy clothes when you go to church, unless maybe you do. I don't know. But it wouldn't be seen as weird as putting on your Sunday best to head off to church. So again, there are certain social conventions here that we're dealing with. And institutions, be it churches, politics, cultural groups, whatever, utilize a variety of tools and methods to guide, to teach, and also, importantly, to enforce these kinds of modes. So, how is this done? Well, you get it through guidance. So things like texts mythologies, scriptures, indoctrination, charter statements on how one behaves. I know in the US you have things like the American Constitution is used as something that is incredibly important. We have something similar here in Canada, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where these become touchstones of what makes somebody an American, Canadian, or what have you. And these create what appears to be this bounded institution in which us, the insiders, can see themselves as different from and even in opposition to those out there, those bad outsiders that we keep talking about. But it's not just the construction of us that helps us, maintain these boundaries. Construction also occurs when we create what those other people are actually all about. Something that we can invent so then we can juxtapose ourselves against them, a way to reify ourselves. So for instance, those outside the boundaries of the purity balls, for instance, are seen as dangerous, problematic. They are sort of a monolithic other that the folks on the inside can then define themselves against. We have those dangerous refugees that are coming in and bringing Sharia law and things like that, right? That's not the case. That's clearly not what's happening, but that is constructed, not so much to define those folks who are coming in, but as a way to help us establish our own boundaries, right? Another one that comes up, and this is maybe one just from my perspective, but there's a big discussion in Canada about how we are not Americans, which I find really quite funny. I mean, Americans and Canadians are, despite what South Park tells us, are exactly the same, except a lot of Canadians will make it very clear that we are fundamentally not Americans. We have healthcare, we don't have guns, and we like hockey. That's pretty much it. It's colder, right? Metric system too, like things like that. I mean, on the grand scheme of things, these are quite minor, but depending on the need to construct an otherness, being us, insiders, Canadians, versus them, outsiders, others, Americans, that is simply something that needs to be reified and needs to be brought up. So in this form of an inverted binary opposition, outsiders essentially are constructed so the insiders can make their own definitions of themselves. So I make all these claims that I'm a Canadian, I like hockey, maple syrup, healthcare, no gun, whatever. That is not so much to define myself, that is to define Americans, this big fictitious American, so then I can make a boundary about how I am not that. Okay, so you have that insider-outsider thing going on. And again, we get this from religious contexts as well. You think about the text from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, where you have Israelites establishing these very distinct sort of cultural practices, kosher laws, their rituals, some elements of monotheism get brought up. It seems like identity for the Israelite, to some extent, was a response to what was going on around them. Food laws seem to be a reaction to the folks who are doing different stuff. So there's one where you, I can't remember the exact reference, but you should not boil a kid in its mother's milk, a small goat, I believe, in its mother's milk. Now, that seems a little weird, but the assumption is that those Canaanites, those others were doing that. So as a way of establishing that we are not them, we will prohibit that. Okay, and that could be an example of that kind of stuff. So anyway, what is so surprising about naturalization of the guiding and constraining nature of social systems is that it is so super effective that you don't know that these things usually are going on. You get kind of caught up in the process, so it does seem natural, which makes a certain sense. If we are all part of this context, if we grew up within the social context that allows, that has constrained us as individuals, well, of course these things are going to seem natural and right and just the way things are. They would be invisible to the insider, okay? And they seem sort of not artificial constructions, but just the way the cosmos is certainly worked out. So you have all these sort of, and it's not just like regular stuff like what to eat and what not to eat, but we also have these things that seem a little outlandish from the outsider perspective. So for example, a lot of our religious traditions have a variety of these really kind of far out claims. You have Moses having a magical staff that does, turns turns into a serpent and stuff. You have Jesus apparently coming back from the dead. That seems weird. You also have Muhammad's various visions, his trip to Jerusalem and flying in a single night. Scientology with his view on aliens, that seems a little strange too. Mormons, the Mormonism claim of Joseph Smith and how he's a prophet. And even sort of the Catholicism's claims of transublimation, where the Eucharist is literally turned into a bit of Jesus, right? Or, okay, literally, figuratively, but the idea is that this is a transformative thing. It's like a magic trick that allows it to happen. Again, we can be quite critical of these things, especially if they're outside of our own context, but there is something when you're on the inside that it does seem reasonable, for lack of a better word, okay? So again, these religious traditions demand that these folks not only sort of replicate these kinds of stories, but they behave in a way that suits these kind of tales. So, things of Jesus coming back from the dead, for instance, can be interpreted in a variety of ways, and then Christians are expected to believe in such a way, okay? So, these subjects then invest themselves in accepting and retelling these institutional myths until the myth itself seems natural. So eventually you start telling yourself that, well, yeah, Jesus died for my sins. That seems like a pretty non-controversial statement, but if you think about it, it's kind of weird, right? But from a Christian-centric context, it makes perfect sense that would be the way we'd look at it. And again, sometimes this process is so effective that even those marginalized by the system itself defend it and tend to reproduce the ideology of the institution. Some of the examples that come up is that during debates around slavery, around the time of the American Civil War, they were Southern slaves who actually defended the institution of slavery. Not because they were pro-slavery, but because they had been so indoctrinated into these ideas that it seemed natural, that it seemed the order of things. Also, during the women's rights movement, especially the first and second wave feminists, a lot of women were the ones who were against women's rights. Essentially, the ones who are marginalized then become the defender of the system. So if I'm in a system that marginalizes me, I could easily become so indoctrinated into it that I would defend the system not because I think it's right, but because I think it's natural. Okay, and this is how these social practices and these social constructions really affect us. Okay, now there are previous postings of some lecture notes that are done by Dr. Bench. I would say from page 4 on of the notes, they're on Blackboard. There's a really good summary that Dr. Bench prepared. I'll let you go over that part on your own. I don't want to just drone on and on one long video for you guys today. But if it is unclear, I will certainly do a follow-up video. If you have any questions, I can certainly go over it, and I can upload it later on in the week. But I just wanted to kind of get your feet wet, see what you think of the material, and kind of get you started on what's happening. Okay, I will hopefully have everything on Blackboard fixed and set up. It's been a bit of a learning curve for me as well. But again, if you aren't sure of any of these points, don't hesitate to email me. If I get enough questions, especially if I get a lot of similar questions, I would just automatically do a follow-up video, sort of have it like it's a little lecture and you guys are asking me questions and we're referring to it back and forth. Okay? So anyway, I hope you guys have a good day. I will talk to you soon, and we'll see you later. Later, taters.